Caleb Whitmore had lived alone for 10 years on a ranch tucked deep in the Texas hills. The world had taught him bitter lessons about love and trust, and he had sworn never to open his heart again. But on one storm-lashed October evening, fate came knocking literally. As thunder cracked like rifle fire across the valley, Malachi heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm, a faint cry carried on the wind. He stepped onto his porch and froze. There, crumpled at his doorstep, lay a young woman in a tattered wedding dress. Rainwater soaked the silk, making it cling to her like a second skin, and her lace veil was torn, trailing behind her like the remnants of shattered dreams. She wasn't moving. For a moment, Malachi thought she might already be gone. 10 years of solitude had built walls around his heart higher than any fence on his property. He could have turned away, just shut the door, poured himself another cup of coffee, and pretended he never saw her. But something in him, some old instinct from his days as a sheriff, wouldn't let him leave her there to die. He knelt beside her, feeling the rain soak through his worn jeans, and checked for a pulse. Faint, but there. "Ma'am," his voice was rusty from years of silence. No response. As he reached to lift her, he noticed the bruises on her wrist, dark finger-shaped marks that told a story he'd seen too many times before. Someone had hurt her. With a low curse, Malachi scooped her up and carried her inside her slight frame, no heavier than a sack of grain despite her sodden dress. He laid her on his couch, the same couch where he'd spent countless nights, convincing himself he was better off alone. As he stoked the fire and grabbed dry blankets, he risked a glance at her face. Even pale and exhausted, she was beautiful, the kind of beautiful that once made him believe in forever. And that terrified him more than any outlaw ever had. When she stirred hours later, her green eyes flickered open wide with confusion. For a moment, their gazes locked. In her eyes, Malachi saw fear, exhaustion, and something else, hope, and he realized with a sinking feeling that his carefully guarded world was about to come crashing down. This woman hadn't just stumbled onto his ranch. She'd stumbled into his heart. And whether he liked it or not, Caleb Whitmore was about to be tested in ways he thought he'd left behind forever. For 10 years, Caleb Whitmore had kept the world at arm's length. His ranch, nestled deep in the rugged Texas hills, was more fortress than home, a place where he could escape the memories of a life that had betrayed him too many times. Once he'd been a lawman with a badge and a belief in justice. Once he'd been a husband who thought love was unbreakable. Those days were long gone. But on one storm-lashed October night, fate sent him a test he hadn't asked for and didn't want. It started with the sound of sobbing, faint but distinct, cutting through the howling wind and the roar of rain on his tin roof. Malachi set his coffee mug down, his weathered fingers tightening around the handle of his rifle out of habit. He stepped onto the porch, his boots creaking on the old wood, and froze. There, collapsed on his steps like a broken bird, was a young woman in a wedding dress. The dress was soaked through silk, clinging to her body like a second skin, mud streaking the once pristine lace. The veil hung in tatters, plastered to her dark hair. She wasn't moving. For one terrible heartbeat, Malachi thought she might already be gone. "Lord Almighty," he muttered under his breath, his voice gravelly from years of disuse. He could have turned away. It would have been easy to step back inside, shut the door, and let the storm wash her away. That's what the Caleb Whitmore of the last decade would have done, the man who'd stopped caring, who'd stopped risking his heart. But when he knelt beside her, rain soaking through his worn jeans, he saw the bruises on her wrists, dark finger-shaped marks. He'd seen that before. "Ma'am," he asked, his voice softer now, almost pleading. No response. Her breathing was shallow, her skin cold. Malachi cursed under his breath and did what he hadn't done in years. He let another human being into his sanctuary. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, throwing warmth and light into the room. He laid her gently on the couch, stripping off her soaked dress with care before wrapping her in dry blankets. As he worked, his eyes kept drifting to her face. Even pale and drawn, she was beautiful. The kind of beautiful that had once made him believe in forever. And that terrified him more than any outlaw ever could. Hours later, she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing vivid green eyes wide with confusion and fear. "You're safe," Malachi said gruffly, keeping his distance. "Safe." She croaked, her voice raw from cold and crying. "Where am I?" "My ranch," he replied. "Middle of nowhere. And from the look of you, that's exactly where you were trying to get." Her gaze darted around the room, seeking exits, weapons, anything. He recognized the look. She wasn't just scared, she was hunted. "You were near frozen," Malachi continued. "That dress was soaked clean through. I didn't think you'd mind dry clothes." He nodded to a folded stack of shirts and pants on the table. "They belonged to my late wife." "Thank you," she whispered, but there was a wary edge in her voice, like she'd been taught that kindness always came with a price. "What do you want?" "Nothing." His answer seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised himself. The storm raged on outside, but Malachi could hear it now, the faint sound of horses' hooves pounding through the mud, getting closer. "They've found me," she whispered, her hand flying to the bruises on her wrist. "Who?" Malachi demanded, his voice sharp. "Clayton Voss," she said, her voice trembling. He was supposed to be my husband." Malachi's blood ran cold. Every lawman from Texas to Nevada knew the name Clayton Voss. Rich, ruthless, and untouchable. He didn't take no for an answer. "You can't stay here," he said quietly. "I can't leave." Tears welled in her eyes. "If they catch me, they'll drag me back. And this time—" She broke off, but Malachi didn't need her to finish the thought. The hoofbeats were louder now. 4, maybe 5 riders. Malachi's jaw tightened. 10 years of solitude had taught him to avoid trouble. But as he watched this fragile woman clutch her borrowed clothes like armor, something inside him shifted. He retrieved his rifle from its rack. "There's a root cellar behind the kitchen. Hide there until I send them away. I won't let you face them alone." "You will," he said firmly. "I've dealt with worse than Clayton Voss." When the knock came, it was polite, almost friendly. But the voice behind it carried venom. "Thorn. I know she's in there. Hand her over and no one gets hurt." Malachi stepped outside, rain soaking through his shirt. The rifle felt heavy but steady in his hands. "She's not here," he said flatly. Silas Hawthorne smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "You're making a mistake, old man. That woman belongs to me. She doesn't belong to anyone," Malachi said. "And if you step one foot on my porch, you'll regret it." For a moment, the storm seemed to hold its breath. 5 armed men against one hermit with a rifle. But Malachi didn't flinch. He'd lived through heartbreak, loss, and regret. He wasn't about to let this woman be added to the list of things he'd failed to protect. In the end, Clayton turned away. But as he mounted his horse, he threw one last warning over his shoulder. "This isn't over, Thorne. You've made yourself an enemy." Malachi stood on his porch long after they'd disappeared into the storm. He knew Clayton would be back, and next time he'd bring more men. But as he looked back through the doorway at the woman huddled by his fire, he knew one thing for certain. He was done running from the world. This time he'd stand his ground. For a decade, Caleb Whitmore had made a fortress of his loneliness. Out in the Texas hills, far from any town or prying eyes, his ranch was a place where the world couldn't reach him. Not the memories of his wife's betrayal, not the corruption that had poisoned his badge when he was sheriff, and certainly not the kind of trouble that came knocking on your door in the middle of the night. But that's exactly what happened on a storm-torn evening in October. He'd been sitting by the fire boots, propped up, staring at the logs as they hissed and cracked, coffee in hand. Outside, the rain was coming down sideways, pelting the roof like a drumbeat of war. He liked nights like this, nights when the storm matched the weight in his chest. Then he heard it, a sound so faint it barely rose above the wind. Sobbing. Malachi froze, every muscle in his body going tight. It had been years since anyone came this far. No one should even know this place existed. Setting his mug down, he grabbed the rifle, leaning against the wall, and moved to the door. When he opened it, the wind nearly tore the hinges off, and there, crumpled on his porch like a broken porcelain doll, was a woman in a wedding dress. Her dress clung to her like a second skin, soaked through mud streaked across the lace. Her veil was in tatters, her hair plastered to her face. For one terrible heartbeat, Malachi thought she was dead. He could have turned away. He'd done it before, turned his back on folks in trouble, told himself it wasn't his problem. But when he knelt beside her, the rain soaking through his jeans, he saw the bruises on her wrists. Dark, finger-shaped marks that spoke of cruelty. "Lord help me," he muttered, and scooped her into his arms. Inside the cabin, he stripped the soaked dress away and wrapped her in a blanket. Her breathing was shallow but steady. As the firelight flickered over her face, he caught his breath. She was beautiful, the kind of beautiful that once would have made him believe in forever. And that terrified him more than the storm ever could. Hours passed before she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing green eyes wide with fear. "You're safe," Malachi said, his voice rough from disuse. "Safe," she whispered, her voice cracked and hoarse. "You're at my ranch, middle of nowhere. Seems like that's where you were aiming for." Her eyes darted around the room, searching for exits, for threats. He knew that look. She wasn't just scared. She was hunted. "What's your name?" he asked. "Evangeline," she said after a pause. "Evie." "All right, Evie. You're freezing. Dress is drying by the fire. There are some old clothes on the table, belonged to someone else once." The pause in his voice told her all she needed to know about that someone. "Thank you," she murmured, pulling the blanket tighter. But he saw the wariness in her eyes. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing," he said flatly. That seemed to confuse her even more. Then he heard it, the faint, rhythmic pounding of hooves cutting through the storm. 4, maybe 5 riders. "They found me," Evangeline whispered, clutching the blanket like armor. "Who's looking for you?" Malachi asked, already checking his rifle. "Clayton Voss," she said, and the name alone was enough to chill his blood. Clayton Voss. Every lawman from Texas to California knew that name. Rich. Ruthless. The kind of man who didn't take no for an answer. I was supposed to marry him today, Evie said, her voice breaking. My brother owes him money. I was the payment. Malachi clenched his jaw. He'd heard stories about Voss before, but hearing this, you can't stay here. I can't leave, she said, her voice trembling. If they find me, they'll drag me back. And this time, she didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need her to. Underscore. When the knock came, it was polite, almost friendly, but the voice that followed carried venom. Caleb Whitmore. I know she's in there. Hand her over and no one gets hurt. Malachi stepped onto the porch, the storm soaking his shirt rifle steady in his hands. She's not here, he said calmly. Silas Hawthorne smiled, a cold, calculating smile. You're making a mistake, old man. That woman belongs to me. She doesn't belong to anyone, Malachi replied. And if you step 1 foot on my porch, you'll regret it. For a moment, time froze. 5 armed men against 1 hermit with a rifle. But Malachi didn't flinch. He'd lost too much already. He wasn't about to let Evie join the list of people he'd failed to protect. In the end, Clayton turned his horse. But as he rode off, he called back. This isn't over, Thorne. You've made yourself an enemy. Underscore. For the next 3 days, the ranch was silent except for the wind. Evie stayed close to the fire, wearing Malachi's late wife's clothes. She cooked what little she could, patched his shirts, and asked no questions about the scars on his hands or the haunted look in his eyes. But on the 4th morning, the sound of hooves returned, this time louder. A dozen riders approached through the mist, their formation tight and purposeful. Clayton had come back, and he wasn't alone. They're here, Malachi said quietly. Evie joined him at the window. Her face was pale but resolute. Maybe I should give myself up, she whispered. If I do, maybe they'll spare you. They won't, Malachi said. Men like Voss don't leave loose ends. And I'm done running. But underscore, this time when Clayton dismounted, he didn't smile. Trade, he called out. The woman for her brother. You hand her over, Jesse goes free, and you get to live out the rest of your days in peace. And if I refuse, Malachi? Asked, stepping onto the porch. Then we burn your little cabin to the ground, Clayton said simply. Before Malachi could answer, Evie stepped forward. I'll go, she said. On one condition, Jesse goes free, unharmed, and you leave Malachi alone forever. Clayton's eyes narrowed. You're in no position to bargain, my dear. Maybe not. But if you harm either of them, I'll make sure the world knows exactly what kind of man you are. Underscore. Then came salvation in the form of pounding hooves and gleaming badges. 6 Federal Marshal Hayes rode in from the hills, rifles ready. Clayton Voss, their leader, called. You're under arrest for murder, extortion, and human trafficking. You have no proof. Clayton roared, his hand moving for his gun. The standoff lasted only seconds. Malachi fired first, his shot grazing Clayton's shoulder. The Marshal Hayes finished the job. When the smoke cleared, Silas Hawthorne lay dead in the mud. His empire of fear crumbled in a single morning. Underscore. In the weeks that followed, Malachi found himself in unfamiliar territory. Evie's brother was freed. The Marshal Hayes exposed the corruption that had protected Voss for years. And Evie Evangeline stayed. She stayed through the long winter nights, through the slow process of healing old wounds. And slowly, Malachi realized that the walls he'd built around his heart weren't as strong as he thought. 6 months later, the church bells rang again. This time, Evangeline walked down the aisle of her own free will, her hand in Malachi's. And for the first time in a decade, Caleb Whitmore believed in forever again. For 10 long years, Caleb Whitmore had kept the world at arm's length. His ranch in the Texas Hill Country was more than just land and timber. It was a sanctuary, a place where memories couldn't follow, and no one could ask him to bleed for causes he no longer believed in. After losing his wife to betrayal and his faith in justice to the corruption of men like Clayton Voss, Malachi had sworn an oath to himself: no more attachments, no more risks. But on a storm-racked October evening, that oath cracked like dry wood under an axe. It began with the sound of sobbing, faint but unmistakable, carried to his porch by the howling wind. He'd thought it was just the storm playing tricks, until he stepped outside and saw her crumpled in a heap at his doorstep, a vision in mud-stained lace and torn silk. A bride alone in the wilderness, her wedding dress clinging to her like a shroud. For a moment, Malachi just stood there, coffee mug still warm in his hand, staring at the broken figure like a man watching his past return in ghostly form. 10 years of solitude, and now this. The universe surely had a cruel sense of humor. Kneeling, he touched her shoulder gently. Her skin was ice cold, her breathing shallow. Close up, he saw the finger-shaped bruises circling her wrists. God help me, he muttered under his breath. And then, as naturally as drawing his next breath, Malachi gathered her in his arms. Inside, he stripped away the soaked dress and wrapped her in a heavy wool blanket. Her lips were blue, her hair plastered to delicate features twisted in pain and exhaustion. Hours later, she stirred. Green eyes fluttered open, wild and unfocused. "You're safe," Malachi said, his voice rusty from years of disuse. "Safe," she whispered, her throat raw. "You're at my ranch, middle of nowhere. The storm found you here." She blinked, still too weak to process his words. He could see it, the fear, the flight. Whoever she was running from, they hadn't just frightened her, they'd broken something inside her. "Evie," she said faintly. "My name's Evie." "All right, Evie, you need rest. Storm's still bad out there. You'll stay here until it passes." But even as she nodded, he saw her eyes dart to the door. Not with the longing to leave, but with terror at the thought someone might burst through it. By dawn, the sound of hoofbeats thundered through the hills. "They've found me," Evie whispered. "Who?" Malachi asked, already checking his rifle. "Clayton Voss," she said, the name heavy with dread. Malachi froze. He knew that name. Everyone did. Silas Hawthorne wasn't just a rich man. He was a predator. He'd built his empire on silver mines and broken lives, the kind of man who bought sheriffs like cattle and crushed anyone who defied him. "I was supposed to marry him yesterday," Evie continued, her voice trembling. "My brother owes him money. The payment." Malachi swore under his breath. He'd heard enough. When the knock came, it was almost courteous. Caleb Whitmore, a smooth voice, called. "I believe you're sheltering my bride." Malachi stepped onto the porch, the wind lashing at his coat, rifle in hand. 4 riders sat their horses like shadows. At their center was Clayton Voss, dressed in fine wool despite the storm, his hat tipped low to keep the rain from his cold eyes. "She's not here," Malachi said. "Don't lie to me," Voss replied mildly, as though speaking to a child. "She's mine. Hand her over, and I'll forget you exist." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Malachi said evenly. A pause. Then Voss smiled, an expression so void of warmth it chilled Malachi more than the rain ever could. "You're making an enemy, Thorn. One you won't live to regret." For 3 tense days, silence reigned over the ranch. Malachi spent the nights cleaning his rifle, listening for the sound of hooves. He tried not to look at Evie as she moved quietly through the cabin, wearing clothes that had once belonged to his late wife. Tried not to see the way her hands trembled when she stirred the soup, or the haunted look in her eyes when she stared into the fire. But on the 4th morning, they came back. This time it wasn't 4 men, it was a dozen. "They're here," Malachi said. Evie stood beside him at the window, her face pale but resolute. "Maybe I should give myself up," she whispered. "No," Malachi said. "Men like Voss don't stop. Even if you go with him, he'll come back for me. And I'm done running." Outside, Voss dismounted with the calm confidence of a man who'd never heard no. "Trade," he called out. "The woman for her brother. You give her up and Jesse walks free. Refuse and we burn this place to the ground." Before Malachi could speak, Evie stepped forward. "I'll go," she said, her voice steady. "On one condition: Jesse goes free unharmed. And you leave Malachi alone." Voss's smile returned, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "You're in no position to negotiate, my dear. Maybe not. But if you harm either of them, I'll make sure the world knows what kind of man you really are." Just then, salvation arrived on the pounding hooves of 6 Federal Marshal Hayes. Their badges glinted in the gray light as they surrounded Voss's men. Clayton Voss, their leader, called. "You're under arrest for murder, extortion, and human trafficking." "You have no proof," Voss snarled. "Oh, we've got plenty," the marshal said, starting with Miss Evangeline's statement. Voss reached for his gun, but Malachi was faster. His shot sent the weapon flying from Voss's hand. The standoff ended in seconds. The Marshal Hayes took Voss and his men into custody. In the weeks that followed, Evie stayed. At first out of necessity, then by choice. Together, she and Malachi repaired the ranch, mended their wounds, and discovered that sometimes 2 broken people can make something whole. 6 months later, the church bells rang again. This time, Evangeline walked down the aisle on her own terms. And Caleb Whitmore, the man who'd sworn off love, found himself vowing to protect it forever. For over a decade, Caleb Whitmore had lived in self-imposed exile on his ranch deep in the Texas hill country. To him, the place wasn't just a patch of earth. It was a fortress. A quiet refuge from a world that had taken everything he cared about. Once he'd been a sheriff, a husband, a man who believed in justice. But after his wife's betrayal and the bitter lesson that law meant nothing when wealth and power were involved, he had turned his back on people entirely. Then came the night that changed everything. The storm was the kind that rattled windows and made the old timbers of his cabin groan under the weight of the wind. Rain fell in sheets, drenching the land until even the coyotes stayed quiet. Malachi sat in his worn leather chair boots, kicked off coffee cooling beside him. That's when he heard it, the faint sound of sobbing almost lost in the howl of the wind. At first he thought it was a trick of memory. But the sound came again, carried across the porch like a ghostly plea. Grabbing his rifle, Malachi eased open the door. There, crumpled on the porch steps, was a woman in a wedding dress so soaked it clung to her like a second skin. Mud streaked the torn lace. Her veil was tangled in her hair, plastered to her pale face. For a moment, Malachi stood frozen. 10 years of solitude, and now this, a bride appearing out of nowhere, like some twisted test of whatever humanity he had left. "Damn it all," he muttered, setting down the rifle. Kneeling, he touched her shoulder. She flinched even in unconsciousness. Up close, he could see the bruises on her wrists, dark finger-shaped marks that told a story he didn't need words to understand. He'd seen those marks before, back when he still wore a badge. "All right, lady," he said softly. "You're not dying on my porch." He scooped her up. She was lighter than he expected, like all the fight had been drained out of her. When she woke hours later, the fire was crackling in the hearth, and she was wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. Her green eyes opened wide, darting around the unfamiliar room. "You're safe," Malachi said from a chair near the window. "This is my ranch. You're about 20 miles from the nearest town." "Safe," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "For now." She tried to sit up, but winced in pain. I can't stay here. You're in no shape to leave." She shook her head. "You don't understand. They'll come for me. Silas Hawthorne doesn't let things go." The name made Malachi's jaw tighten. He knew Voss. Everyone in the territory did. The man wasn't just rich. He owned half the county, and the law bent around him like a willow in the wind. "You were supposed to marry him," Malachi guessed. Her silence was answer enough. The knock came the next morning. It wasn't loud, more like a gentleman's tap, but Malachi knew better. Caleb Whitmore, a smooth voice, called through the door. "I'm looking for a runaway bride. You wouldn't happen to have seen her, would you?" Malachi glanced at Evangeline, huddled behind the couch. Her face was pale with fear. "She's not here," he called back. "Don't lie to me," Clayton's voice sharpened. "Hand her over and no harm will come to you." Malachi's fingers tightened around his rifle. "She's not yours to take. That's where you're wrong." Through the window, Malachi counted 4 riders, all armed. Clayton sat his horse like a man who owned the world. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Thorne Clayton said. "Be smart. Hand her over." Malachi stepped onto the porch, rifle resting casually in his hands. "You want her? You'll have to come through me." For a moment there was silence, thick and heavy as the clouds above. Clayton's smile turned cold. "So be it." That night, Malachi and Evangeline sat by the fire. He cleaned his rifle with the practiced ease of an old lawman, while she stared into the flames. "You're risking your life for me," she said quietly. Why, he looked at her, seeing not just fear but strength in her eyes. "Because 10 years ago I didn't save a woman who needed help. I won't make that mistake again." At dawn, Clayton returned with twice as many men. But this time Malachi wasn't alone. A federal marshal arrived from the territorial capital, tipped off by a young deputy who still believed in justice. "Clayton Voss," the marshal called out. "You're under arrest for murder and human trafficking." "You've got no proof," Clayton snarled. "Oh, we've got plenty," the marshal replied, starting with Miss Evangeline's testimony. The gunfight that followed was short but brutal. Malachi's shot struck first, sending Clayton's gun spinning from his hand. When the smoke cleared, Voss lay in the mud, alive but defeated. Weeks later, the ranch was quiet again. But this time Malachi wasn't alone. "You don't have to stay," he told her one evening. "I know," Evangeline said, smiling softly. "But I want to." And for the first time in 10 years, Malachi felt the walls around his heart crumble. As we grow older, life often teaches us that the heart is fragile. Loss, betrayal, and hardship can leave scars so deep that it feels easier to shut the world out and live behind carefully built walls. But stories like Caleb Whitmore's remind us of something vital. No matter how much pain we've endured, it's never too late to let someone in and rediscover the power of compassion. For 10 long years, Malachi believed solitude was the only way to protect himself from heartbreak. He built a life in the quiet hills, away from people, away from memories. Yet when a frightened young woman in a torn wedding dress collapsed on his porch, he was faced with a choice: continue protecting his peace, or open his door and his heart to a stranger in need. This choice speaks to a universal truth many of us face in later years. Do we keep clinging to safety, or do we take the risk of caring again? True caring means vulnerability. It means facing the possibility of loss. But it also means connection, purpose, and the chance to stand for what's right, even when the cost is high. Malachi's decision to help Evangeline wasn't just about saving her, it was about saving himself. By protecting her, he remembered the man he used to be: a protector, a fighter for justice, and someone who believed in the good worth fighting for. For those of us in our golden years, this story is a gentle reminder that it's never too late to make a difference. Acts of kindness, no matter how small, ripple outward. And opening our hearts even after loss can lead to the kind of healing we didn't think possible. So, if life brings someone to your doorstep needing help or understanding, perhaps the bravest thing you can do is open that door. Because sometimes the greatest gift isn't in protecting yourself from hurt. It's in finding someone worth protecting, even if only for a moment.